He walked into that cafe like he owned the city, and for a moment, everyone in the room believed he did. When Dominic Reeves locked his eyes on the woman sitting alone by the window, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. She was beautiful, poised, and completely unguarded. He saw a target. What he didn't see, what none of them saw, was the quiet man in the worn jacket sitting in the corner, watching. Some men carry their danger openly, like a weapon on display. Others carry it the way Ryan Mercer carried everything in his life, silently, patiently, and only when the moment truly demanded it. If this story already has you leaning forward, you're exactly where we want you. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story that hits this hard. Hit that like button. And drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We genuinely want to see how far these stories travel. Now settle in. This one doesn't slow down. The morning had started the way most of Ryan Mercer's mornings started. Badly. Not catastrophically. Nothing dramatic. Just the accumulation of small, grinding problems that seem to follow single fathers the way shadow follows sunlight. The kitchen faucet at their apartment on Caldwell Street had been dripping since Tuesday. His daughter Lily had informed him at 7:15 that she needed $20 for a school field trip she'd neglected to mention until the morning of. And when he finally loaded his toolbox into the back of his truck and pulled out onto Morrison Avenue, the city of Harlow was already doing what it did best in November, coating every surface in a thin gray misery that couldn't decide whether it wanted to be rain or fog. Ryan drove with one hand on the wheel and a cup of gas station coffee balanced on his knee, because the truck's cup holder had broken sometime in September and he hadn't gotten around to fixing it. He fixed other people's things for a living. His own stuff waited. He was 40 minutes ahead of schedule, which almost never happened, so when he passed the corner of 5th and Delancey and saw the warm amber light spilling out of Crestwood Café through the gray morning, he made a decision he almost never made. He pulled over. A coffee. A real one. 15 minutes off the clock, just to sit somewhere warm and drink something that didn't taste like a truck stop. He could afford 15 minutes. Barely. Inside, Crestwood Café was the kind of place that existed in a slightly different era than the rest of Harlow. Dark wood paneling, mismatched chairs, the smell of ground coffee and something baked, a chalkboard menu behind the counter with the day's specials written in someone's careful handwriting. There were maybe 12 customers inside. A mix of people on laptops, a retired couple sharing a newspaper, 2 young women talking in low voices near the window. Ryan found a corner table near the back, set his toolbox on the floor beside his chair, and ordered a black coffee from the server who came by. He didn't look at his phone. He just sat and drank and watched the morning through the window with the particular stillness of a man who had learned that quiet moments were worth paying attention to while you had them. He noticed the woman at the window table almost immediately, not because she was beautiful, though she was in an understated way that had nothing to do with effort. She was maybe 30, dressed in a dark charcoal blazer over a cream blouse, her dark hair pulled back simply. She was working, a laptop open in front of her, a half-finished coffee at her elbow, and she had the focused, slightly tense look of someone managing things, important things. You could tell by the way her eyes moved across the screen, not casual browsing, but decisions, the kind that had weight behind them. What Ryan noticed more than anything was that she was alone, not lonely. There's a difference. She was a woman who was comfortable in her own company, which was a different thing entirely. But she was alone in the way that sometimes made people mistake composure for vulnerability. Ryan turned back to his coffee. He was thinking about the faucet on Caldwell Street when the door opened. Dominic Reeves didn't enter a room so much as he occupied it. He was a big man, not quite Ryan's height, but broader in the way that came from a gym membership, and the conviction that size was the same as power. I was in his mid-40s, thick-necked, wearing a jacket that cost more than most people's rent in this neighborhood. He had 2 men with him, younger, the kind of young that was trying to look dangerous and mostly succeeding, who positioned themselves near the door like they'd rehearsed it. Ryan knew the type. He'd seen versions of Dominic Reeves in a dozen different countries, wearing a dozen different faces. The posture was always the same, the casual contempt. The way a man moved through a space when he'd learned, through repetition, that most people would get out of his way. The cafe didn't go completely silent, but it changed. The way a room changes when a storm front moves in, a drop in pressure, a collective tightening, conversations that suddenly became quieter and more private. Dominic scanned the room once, and his gaze landed on the woman by the window. Ryan watched him decide. It wasn't a decision that took long. Dominic was already moving, a slow, deliberate walk across the cafe, hands in his jacket pockets, that particular swagger of a man who expected an audience. His two associates stayed near the door, but both were watching. Ryan set down his coffee cup. Hey. Dominic stopped beside the woman's table, looking down at her. You're in my spot. The woman. She didn't look up immediately. She finished the line she was reading first, which Ryan noted was either remarkable self-possession or a calculated response. Then she looked up, and her expression was politely blank. I'm sorry? This table. Dominic smiled, but it was the kind of smile that had nothing warm in it. It's where I sit when I come in here, so you should probably move. A couple at the nearby table had already pulled their chairs slightly, unconsciously creating distance. The server behind the counter had gone very still, pretending to wipe down the espresso machine. The woman looked at Dominic for a moment, then she looked back at her laptop. There are several empty tables, she said, her voice calm and even. I'm sure you'll find one that suits you. Ryan noticed the slight shift in Dominic's posture. The smile didn't disappear, but it cooled. You're not from around here, Dominic said, pulling out the chair across from her and sitting down uninvited, elbows on the table. So you don't know how things work. I understand how tables work, she said, without looking up. You sit at empty ones. Someone near the counter stifled a sound that might have been a laugh. Dominic's jaw tightened. You've got a mouth on you, he said. I like that, for about 30 seconds. Now she looked up. I'm going to ask you to leave my table. And I'm going to ask you what your name is. He leaned forward. And your number. And whether you've got plans later, because I think you and I don't. Flat, final. She looked back at her screen. Dominic sat back in the chair. He was quiet for a moment, and the quiet was worse than the talking, because it meant he was recalibrating. You know what I think? He said finally. I think you think you're better than everybody in this room, sitting there with your fancy laptop and your fancy clothes, working on your important work. He said the last two words with a mocking emphasis that was clearly designed to sting. You don't even look at people, like we're not worth your time. She stopped typing. Dominic Reeves, she said, and his name in her mouth was like a door closing. I know exactly who you are. I know you run collections for Marcus Webb in 3 neighborhoods. I know you have 2 pending assault charges that haven't gone anywhere because witnesses develop memory problems. And I know that what you're doing right now, she met his eyes directly, is what you always do when you're in a room and you need people to watch you. The entire cafe had gone quiet now. Not performing quiet, actually quiet, the kind that happens when something shifts and everyone in a room feels it. Dominic's expression had changed. The smile was completely gone. You want to be careful, he said, his voice low now, talking to me like that. I'm having coffee, she said. I'd like to keep doing that. Dominic stood slowly. For a moment Ryan thought it was over, that the woman's calm certainty had been enough, that Dominic would absorb the loss and walk away with whatever dignity he could reconstruct. Some men could do that. Ryan had met them. Dominic Reeves was not one of them. He reached down and closed the woman's laptop. Hey, look at me when I'm talking to you. His voice had dropped further, into something uglier and quieter. I asked you a question. What's your name? Let go of my laptop. What's your name? He put his hand flat on top of the closed laptop, pressing down. She started to reach for it, and that's when he grabbed her wrist. Not hard enough to break anything, hard enough to make a point, hard enough to make her stop moving. Hard enough to make every person in that cafe look at their table, or their phone, or their coffee, making themselves small, making themselves invisible, because this was the moment where you decided whether you were involved or not, and almost everyone in that room was deciding, very quickly, that they were not. Let her go. The voice came from the corner table. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. There was something in its quality, measured, deliberate, the voice of someone who had learned that tone could carry more weight than volume, that cut through the room without effort. Dominic looked up. Ryan Mercer was standing beside his corner table. He hadn't crossed the room yet. He was just standing, his worn jacket slightly open, his toolbox on the floor beside his chair, a half-empty coffee cup on the table. He looked, objectively, like a man who repaired things for a living. He looked like someone's dad. He looked, by every visual measure available, like a person who had absolutely no business inserting himself into this situation. Dominic looked at him for a long beat. Then he started to laugh. It wasn't a private laugh. It was designed for the room, and the room, grateful for a reason to break the tension in a direction that felt safe, responded. A few chuckles. Someone near the counter quietly shook their head. One of Dominic's associates near the door made a comment too low to hear, and the other one smiled. "I'm sorry," Dominic said, still holding the woman's wrist. "Did somebody say something?" "I asked you to let her go," Ryan said. Same tone, same measured pace. "That's twice now." Dominic turned to face him fully, releasing the woman's wrist to do it, which he probably didn't even register. I was looking at Ryan the way he looked at anything he'd already decided wasn't a threat, with a kind of bored amusement. "What are you, her husband?" He looked Ryan up and down. "She's way out of your price range, pal. Why don't you sit back down and drink your coffee before you embarrass yourself?" More laughter. Not mean laughter, necessarily. The laughter of people who were uncomfortable and wanted the situation to resolve in any direction that let them off the hook. Ryan walked toward them. He walked like a man with nowhere to be. No urgency, no performance, just the measured footsteps of someone crossing a room because the room needed to be crossed. He stopped about 4 feet from Dominic, close enough to talk without raising his voice. "I don't know you," Ryan said, "and I don't have a problem with you. But I'm asking you to step back from this table, leave this woman alone, and let the rest of these people finish their mourning." He paused. "That's a reasonable ask." Dominic studied him. He was trying to read what he was looking at, and something, not fear, not quite, but a flicker of something that preceded it, moved behind his eyes and was quickly buried. "You got about 3 seconds to walk away," Dominic said, "before this gets real bad for you." "I know," Ryan said. Then he was inside Dominic's reach. Later, people who were in the cafe that morning would struggle to describe exactly what happened in the next 6 seconds. Not because it was fast, though it was, but because it looked nothing like what they expected. There was no swing, no collision, none of the messy brutality of a bar fight. Ryan moved the way a mechanism moves, with precision, economy, each motion serving an exact purpose and no other. A step, a shift of weight. His left hand came up and redirected Dominic's reaching arm with something that looked almost gentle. His right hand found the back of Dominic's forearm at a particular angle. The sound Dominic made wasn't a yell. It was more of a truncated exhale, the sound of air leaving a body involuntarily. Then Dominic Reeves, the man 3 neighborhoods called when they needed someone convinced of something, was on the floor of Crestwood Café, face against the hardwood, one arm locked behind his back at an angle that made it clear beyond any doubt that it could go further, and that further would be something he'd remember for a long time. He wasn't unconscious. He was completely aware of everything that was happening. He just couldn't move. Ryan held the position for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to be certain, not a moment longer. Then he stepped back and straightened up, and that was it. No posturing, no standing over the man. He turned, walked back to the woman's table, picked up her laptop from where Dominic had left it, and set it in front of her. "Are you all right?" he asked. She looked up at him. Vivian Sterling had built a company worth $300 million by the time she was 28 years old. She had sat across tables from senators and investment bankers and people who believed their net worth exempted them from common decency. She had been underestimated in rooms full of people who would later regret it, and she had learned very early to keep her reactions close and her face neutral. She looked at this man in his worn jacket, with his calloused hands and his gas station coffee and his toolbox on the floor, and for a moment she had absolutely nothing to say. "Yes," she managed. "I'm fine." "Good." Ryan glanced at Dominic, who was slowly pushing himself up from the floor, breathing hard, his 2 associates having crossed the room to help him, though neither had gotten anywhere near Ryan. "You might want to get your things together," Ryan said to Vivian, without any particular alarm in his voice. "He's going to be angry when the shock wears off." "You think?" she said. "Men like that usually are." He picked up his toolbox and his coffee. "The embarrassment is worse than the pain." Dominic was upright now, braced between his 2 associates, his face a particular dark shade that had nothing to do with the physical encounter. His eyes were on Ryan with a fixed, hollow quality that Ryan recognized. He'd seen it before. It was the look of a man calculating, not retreating. You know what you just did? Dominic's voice had changed, quieter, the performance stripped out of it, something colder underneath. You have absolutely no idea what you just did. Ryan looked at him for a moment. I asked you twice, he said simply. Dominic pointed a finger at him. Not a gesture, a promise. Then he looked at Vivian. Both of you. He let the two words sit there, complete on their own. His associates walked him out. The door closed. The cafe was very quiet. Then, all at once, it wasn't. Conversations erupting, phones appearing, the server behind the counter exhaling loudly and leaning against the back wall. A woman at a corner table started crying quietly, which seemed to surprise her as much as anyone. The retired couple with the newspaper were both staring openly at Ryan, the newspaper forgotten, their coffee going cold. Ryan sat back down at his corner table. He picked up his coffee. It had gone lukewarm during all of this. He drank it anyway. Vivian Sterling sat at her table and watched him do it. She noticed that his hands were steady. She noticed that he showed no particular interest in the reactions around him. Not the stares, not the few people who started to approach him and then seemed to lose their nerve. He wasn't absorbing the moment. He wasn't riding it. He was just a man who had done something because it needed doing, and was now drinking the remainder of his coffee because he'd paid for it. She opened her laptop. Her wrist ached faintly where Dominic had grabbed it. She looked at it, then at the man in the corner, then at the door through which Dominic Reeves had just walked. Outside, through the cafe window, she could see a black SUV idling at the curb. The two associates were beside it. Their phones were out. Vivian looked back at Ryan Mercer. She had a feeling, the same feeling she'd had before certain board meetings, before certain deals, the feeling that something had just begun that was not, in any meaningful sense, finished yet, that the next few hours of her life were going to be significantly more complicated than she had planned. She reached for her coffee. Her hand was steadier than she expected. The server, a young woman named Becca, who had worked at Crestwood for 3 years and had seen plenty of difficult mornings, brought Ryan a fresh coffee without being asked. She set it down beside his lukewarm one, didn't say anything, and walked away. It was the most honest thank you available to her in that moment, and Ryan understood it for what it was. He nodded at her back. Around him, the cafe was trying to return to normal in the way that places try to return to normal after something ruptures the ordinary flow of a morning, with too much noise, too much deliberate conversation, people performing casualness for each other's benefit. Two men near the window were speaking in low, rapid voices, occasionally glancing at him. A woman on her laptop kept looking up at the door as if verifying it was still closed. The retired couple with the newspaper had abandoned all pretense of reading it. They were watching Ryan openly, the man with an expression Ryan couldn't quite read, something between assessment and something older than that. Ryan drank his fresh coffee. I was aware of Vivian Sterling looking at him from across the room. He'd been aware of it since she sat back down and opened her laptop, which she was no longer actually working on. He could tell by the angle of her eyes above the screen. He didn't acknowledge it. People needed a moment after something like that, and the best thing you could do was give it to them without making it into something. Excuse me. He looked up. She was standing beside his table. Up close, she was slightly taller than he'd estimated, maybe 5'7", and she'd collected herself with the kind of efficiency that told him she was very used to collecting herself. Her wrist had a faint red mark where Dominic's hand had been. She was looking at him with an expression that was evaluating something and doing it honestly, without pretending otherwise. You mind? She said, nodding at the empty chair across from him. Go ahead. She sat. She had her coffee with her, the original one, which had to be cold by now, but she wrapped both hands around the cup anyway. For a moment she didn't say anything. Ryan let the silence sit. He'd learned a long time ago that silence wasn't always a problem that needed solving. Vivian Sterling, she said finally. Ryan Mercer. She nodded. He got the sense she was filing that away. I want to say thank you. I'm going to, and then I'm going to say something else, so just let me get the thank you out first. All right. Thank you. What you did, the way you handled that, I've had security contractors who couldn't have managed it that cleanly. She paused. That's not a figure of speech. I've actually employed security contractors. I figured. What does that mean? The way you talked to him, Ryan said. You knew his name, his business, the charges. You weren't running that from memory. You'd looked him up, which means you knew there was something worth looking up, which means you've dealt with that type before in some professional capacity. He picked up his coffee. The laptop and the blazer at 7:40 in the morning helped too. Vivian looked at him for a moment. You paid that much attention. Habit, he said, not elaborating. She accepted that. Okay, here's the other thing. She set her cup down. Dominic Reeves is not the kind of man who walks away from something like this. What you did to him, in front of witnesses, in his own neighborhood, he's going to treat that like a debt, and he has the resources to collect on it. She met his eyes directly. I want to offer you compensation, not a small amount. Whatever your daily rate is, I'll triple it, extended, plus I can arrange private security for... No, Ryan said. You didn't let me finish. You were going to offer money and security, he said. The answer's the same. Why? He thought about how to answer that without sounding like he was performing humility, which he wasn't. Because I didn't do it for you. I mean, I did it for you, but not in the way that creates an obligation. He was hurting someone who asked him to stop. That's a pretty simple thing to respond to. He looked at her. You don't owe me anything. Vivian Sterling had a particular face she made when she was processing something she hadn't accounted for. Her assistant Marcus could have told Ryan that. Her board members could have told him that. She was making it now. A slight narrowing of the eyes, a fractional compression at the corners of her mouth, the look of someone recalculating. Most people, she said carefully, who do something like what you just did, they want something out of it, even if it's just the story. Most people didn't have the morning I had, Ryan said. I just wanted a decent cup of coffee. A short sound escaped her. Not quite a laugh, but in the neighborhood of one. Is that true? My kitchen faucet's been dripping for 4 days. I've got a job on Caldwell Street I'm already behind on. And my daughter told me at 7:15 this morning that she needs $20 for a field trip she forgot to mention. He turned the coffee cup in his hand. I pulled over because I had 15 minutes and the place looked warm. That's the whole story. You're a plumber? General maintenance, plumbing, electrical, basic carpentry. Whatever needs doing. She was quiet for a beat. And before that? Ryan looked at her. The way you moved, she said. Not pushing, exactly. Just being honest about what she'd observed. That's not something you learn on a job site. He didn't answer immediately, and she didn't fill the space. He appreciated that, the willingness to let a question sit without pushing it into the ground. Before that, he said, I did something else. For a while. He looked toward the window. That's not really a cafe conversation. Fair enough, she said. Outside, the black SUV was gone. The curb where it had idled was empty now, just wet pavement and a city going about its morning. Ryan watched the street for a moment, the particular quality of attention that looked like casual observation but wasn't, and turned back to his coffee. You should call someone, he said. If you've got a security team, now's the time to check in with them. He's not done. I know he's not done. She pulled it out her phone, then stopped. She looked at him with something that was close to frustration, but not directed at him. Can I ask you something direct? Sure. Does this bother you at all? The fact that you just made a serious enemy in this city, defending a woman you've never met, for no compensation, and now you're sitting here finishing your coffee like you're between plumbing calls? Ryan considered the question genuinely. Yeah, he said after a moment. It bothers me. In what way? In the way that I had a quiet morning planned and now I don't. He finished his coffee and set the cup down. But the alternative was watching him drag you around a cafe because nobody in the room was willing to say something. And I've seen what happens to people after that. Not to the guy who does it, to everyone else in the room who looked away. That bothers me more. Vivian Sterling looked at him for what felt like a long time. Long enough that it started to feel like something other than a professional assessment. My office is 12 blocks from here, she said. I have a security briefing in 40 minutes, but after that... Ryan's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it. A text from the building manager on Caldwell Street. You coming or not? He stood and picked up his toolbox. I've got to get to work. Right. She stood too, reflexively. Of course. A brief pause in which something shifted slightly in her expression. A recalibration she did smoothly but not quite seamlessly. Then at least let me, if things escalate with Reeves. If things escalate, Ryan said, I'll manage it. He looked at her. You should actually call your security people. Right now, walking to your car. I have a driver. Call them before you get in the car, he said, and have them check the route. Something crossed her face. The first real acknowledgement that the situation was more serious than her composure was letting on. You think he'd move that fast? I think he walked out of here with nothing but injured pride and two guys with phones, Ryan said. Yeah, I think he'd move that fast. Vivian nodded once, pulling out her phone. Mercer, she said, as he started toward the door. He turned. The field trip, she said. $20. She was already looking at her phone, not at him. Don't be stubborn about it. Ryan almost said something. Then he picked up his toolbox and walked out. He was 4 blocks down Morrison Avenue, toolbox in one hand, when he became aware of the car. It wasn't the black SUV. That would have been too obvious. It was a dark gray sedan, 2 cars behind him on a street where the traffic was light enough that 2 cars behind was essentially following. He'd first noticed it when he pulled out of the cafe's side street, and it had pulled out 30 seconds later. It had maintained the same distance for 4 blocks, through 2 turns. Ryan drove normally. He made a 3rd turn he didn't need to make. The sedan made it too. He called the Caldwell Street building manager, told him he'd be another 20 minutes, and then drove a deliberately circuitous route to the job site, not trying to lose the tail, just establishing that it was there and logging its patterns. A late model Chrysler, 2 occupants, visible through the rear window. Neither of them was Dominic. He arrived at Caldwell Street and went to work. For the next 4 hours, he did what he'd come to do. A corroded supply line under a first-floor bathroom sink, a tripped circuit breaker in the hallway panel, a window in apartment 4C that had been painted shut and needed freeing before winter made it a fire hazard. He worked methodically without rushing, because rushing on a job created the kind of mistakes that sent you back on your own time and your own dollar. The building was one of the older ones on Caldwell, pre-war construction, mostly solid but full of the particular complaints that old buildings developed over decades of deferred maintenance. He thought about Vivian Sterling while he worked, but not in a way he could have cleanly defined. She was competent and calm under pressure, which he respected. She was also, clearly, a person who was accustomed to solving problems with resources, which sometimes made people underestimate the problems that resources couldn't solve. He hoped she'd called her security people. He suspected she had. She'd struck him as someone who absorbed practical advice when it was practical. He finished on Caldwell Street at 11:40, loaded his truck, and drove to pick up lunch from a diner 2 neighborhoods over where the counter guy knew his order and didn't make him talk while he ate. It was while he was eating, a turkey sandwich and black coffee, booth by the window, that his phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer it. Then something, the same instinct that had made him look up in the cafe that morning, made him pick it up. Mercer. A pause. Then, "You're hard to find, considering you're in the book." It was a voice he didn't recognize, male, middle-aged, the particular flat effect of someone trying to sound casual while being anything but. "Who is this?" "A friend of Dominic's. I just wanted to reach out, man to man, and let you know that what happened this morning. That's something Dominic takes very personally, and people who make things personal with Dominic," another pause, the theatrical kind, "they tend to find that Harlow gets a lot smaller very quickly." Ryan ate a bite of his sandwich. "You there?" the voice said. "I'm here." "You don't have anything to say?" "Not particularly." Ryan looked out the window at the street. "Tell your friend the woman at the cafe table asked him to stop. Then I asked him twice. He made his choice." He paused. "Tell him I'm not hard to find if he wants to have a direct conversation." The line was quiet for a moment. "That's a real interesting attitude," the voice said. "It's the only one I've got." Ryan hung up. He finished his sandwich. He wasn't scared exactly. Fear was something he'd had a complicated relationship with for a long time. It was information, useful information, but it was only one piece of a larger picture, and the useful thing was to let it inform your preparation without letting it drive your behavior. What he felt now was something more like reluctance. He'd built something careful and deliberate over the past 3 years, a life on a scale he could actually sustain, a routine that kept his daughter fed and housed, and more importantly, stable. Lily was 8 years old, and she'd already lost her mother. The last thing she needed was her father dragging the wrong kind of attention into their orbit. He paid for his lunch, left a 5 on the counter, and sat in his truck for a few minutes before starting it. Then he drove to the school to pick up Lily, because it was Tuesday, and on Tuesdays he always picked her up, and that was the kind of thing he wasn't going to stop doing because some neighborhood heavy was nursing his pride. Lily was waiting outside the main entrance with her backpack hanging off one shoulder and her jacket half unzipped because she ran warm and always forgot it would be cold again by 3 in the afternoon. She was 8 years old and had her mother's eyes and her grandmother's stubbornness and a gap between her front teeth that the dentist said would close on its own, but which Lily had decided she liked. She climbed into the truck and tossed her backpack in the footwell. "Mrs. Garfield gave us homework over Thanksgiving," she announced, "which is basically a crime." "What kind of homework?" "We have to write about something we're grateful for." She buckled her seatbelt with the particular vigor of someone registering protest. "It's manipulative." Ryan pulled out of the school lot. "How is it manipulative?" "Because she knows nobody's going to write something bad if the assignment is about being grateful. So it's basically making us say nice things without us realizing we're saying nice things." She looked out the window. "I'm grateful that I noticed." He glanced at her sidelong. "You could write that." "Mrs. Garfield would not appreciate that." "No," Ryan agreed. "Probably not." They drove in comfortable silence for a few blocks. Lily had a particular talent for silence. She could fill a room when she wanted to, but she also had these pockets of quiet that Ryan had come to recognize as her thinking face, the internal version of whatever she did when she was deciding something. "There were police at Sophie's mom's salon today," Lily said eventually. "Sophie said someone got beat up in a cafe on 5th Street. Was that near where you were this morning?" Ryan kept his eyes on the road. "Yeah, it was near there." "Did you see what happened?" "I was there when it happened," he said. Lily turned to look at him directly. "Were you involved?" He'd made a decision when she was very young that he wasn't going to lie to her. Not about the important things. He could redirect, simplify, spare her the details. But the outright lie was a door he didn't want to open, because once you started, you had to keep building around it. "A man was bothering someone," Ryan said. "I asked him to stop." Lily was quiet for a moment. "Did you have to?" she started. "He didn't want to stop on his own." Another silence. She turned back to the window, watching the city go by. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. "Are you in trouble?" "No," he said. And then, because she'd inherited her mother's ability to read a non-answer, "It might be complicated for a little while, but I'm handling it." "You always say that. It's usually true." "It's true right up until it isn't," Lily said, with the particular solemn precision of an 8-year-old who had been listening to adult conversations longer than most people realized. Ryan didn't have a clean answer for that. He reached over and briefly squeezed her shoulder, which was about as much as she'd accept in public, even with nobody watching. "I'm handling it," he said again. The evening was a negotiated peace between homework and dinner, Lily at the kitchen table with her notebook while Ryan made pasta from what was in the refrigerator, which wasn't a lot, because grocery shopping was something that kept sliding to the bottom of his week. He found half a pound of penne, a can of crushed tomatoes, some Italian sausage that was technically still good, and a block of Parmesan that had gone slightly hard at the edges, but was fine once you got past it. He cooked, and Lily wrote about what she was grateful for, and by the time dinner was on the table, she'd produced 4 sentences about the gap in her teeth, which she'd decided to go with anyway. "Mrs. Garfield will think you're being difficult," Ryan said. "Mrs. Garfield thinks I'm being difficult when I ask questions in class," Lily said. "I might as well be consistently difficult." Ryan ate his pasta and thought about the gray sedan, and Dominic Reeves's flat-voiced friend on the phone, and Vivian Sterling's face when he'd walked toward Dominic across the cafe floor. The particular controlled neutrality of a woman deciding how much of what she was actually feeling she was going to let show. He thought about the way she'd said thank you, direct, no softening, no social decoration around it. He'd known people who used politeness like a layer of insulation between themselves and whatever they were actually experiencing. She wasn't one of them. When she'd said thank you, she'd meant it exactly as much as the words carried, no more and no less. And that was the kind of honesty you didn't always find in a person. His phone sat on the counter, quiet. He did the dishes. He helped Lily with 2 long division problems she'd been saving to argue about. He checked the lock on the apartment door twice, which was once more than usual, and noted the fact and chose not to explain it to himself in terms that required action. Just before 9, Lily's babysitter Donna, who lived 2 floors up and was 63 years old and had no illusions about her role, which was to make sure Lily ate, did homework, and went to bed on the rare occasions Ryan had to work late, texted to say she'd left a container of soup in the hall. Ryan retrieved it without bothering to wonder why Donna always made soup when the news featured something upsetting. He was locking the door again when his phone lit up. A number he didn't recognize, but different from the afternoon's call. He picked it up. Mr. Mercer. A woman's voice, professional, clipped. My name is Janet Osei. I'm head of security for Sterling Consolidated. Ms. Sterling asked me to contact you. Ryan leaned against the wall beside the door. All right. We've been monitoring Dominic Reeves's associates since this morning. There's been significant communication traffic among a group of roughly 8 individuals, and based on the pattern, we have reason to believe they're planning an escalated response, tonight or tomorrow. A brief pause. Ms. Sterling wanted you to know. I appreciate that. She also wanted me to reiterate, the offer's still no, Ryan said. A short pause. She anticipated that. Did she? She said to tell you. Another pause, the sound of someone reading from a note. The same logic you applied in the cafe applies here. Nobody should have to handle this alone because they've decided not to accept help. Ryan was quiet for a moment. He turned that over. Tell her I heard that, he said. She'll also want to know if you have any concerns about your daughter's safety. And there it was. The sentence that changed the calculation. Ryan stood in the hallway of his apartment with the phone against his ear and the familiar sounds of Lily's television coming from behind the bedroom door, some cartoon with an overdramatic score, and he let himself sit with the shape of the problem as it actually existed, not as he'd been framing it. Yes, he said. I have concerns. Ms. Sterling has suggested that Donna Paulson, your neighbor, 2 floors up, could be relocated temporarily to a secure location with Lily if... No, Ryan said. Lily stays in her routine. She goes to school. She comes home. That's non-negotiable. He moved away from the wall and walked to the window, looking down at the street. The gray sedan wasn't there. The street looked the way it always looked, which didn't mean anything. If the risk calculus changes, I'll reach out. Ms. Sterling's direct line, Janet said, and recited a number. Any hour. Got it. One more thing. The woman's voice shifted, still professional, but with something added, something that wasn't on the script. What you did this morning, I've been in security for 19 years. I don't know many civilians who would have stepped in. I'm not exactly a civilian, Ryan said. A brief silence. No, she said. That was clear from the footage. Ryan blinked. There's footage. Café has 2 cameras. Miss Sterling's team pulled the files this afternoon. He hadn't considered that. He wasn't sure how he felt about it, but he filed it and moved on because there was nothing actionable about it right now. Good night, Ms. Osei. Good night, Mr. Mercer. He hung up and stood at the window for another few minutes, watching the street. A couple walked past with a dog. A delivery truck idled at the corner and then moved on. Ordinary city sounds, the ones that formed the background noise of his life and Lily's life, the texture of the days they'd built together since Claire died. He thought about what Vivian Sterling had said to him through her security chief. Nobody should have to handle this alone because they've decided not to accept help. He thought about how he'd said the same thing to himself, in different words, when he'd stood up from the corner table that morning. He turned off the kitchen light and went to check on Lily. She was asleep with her notebook open on her chest, the gratitude assignment face up, her 4 careful sentences about the gap in her teeth visible in the light from the hall. The television was still on. Ryan turned it off, moved the notebook to the desk, and pulled her blanket up. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he went back to the living room, sat in the chair by the window, and didn't sleep. Outside, Harlow continued doing what it always did, generating its low, constant noise, its car horns and distant conversations, and the particular rumble of the city settling into the hours between midnight and morning when it was the quietest it ever got, which still wasn't very quiet at all. Ryan watched the street and thought about the 8 individuals Janet Osei's team had identified and the pattern of communication she'd described, and the gray sedan that had followed him for 4 blocks before he'd arrived at Caldwell Street. He was a man who had spent years reading situations before they became situations, And this situation had the particular feeling, the weight and shape of it, the way the pieces were organizing themselves, of something that was going to move before the city woke up tomorrow. He sat by the window and he waited, because waiting, done correctly, was also a kind of preparation. He dozed once, briefly, sometime after 2 in the morning, the chair by the window, his jacket still on, the kind of shallow sleep that wasn't really sleep so much as the body insisting on a minimum. He came back to full awareness at 2:43 without an alarm, the way he always did, the way that had been trained into him so thoroughly that it had stopped feeling like a skill and started feeling like a condition. The street below was empty. He sat for a moment taking inventory, the sounds of the building settling, Lily's door still closed, the faint drip from the kitchen faucet that he still hadn't fixed. Everything where it was supposed to be. He got up and made coffee. By 5:30 he'd showered, eaten something that didn't deserve to be called breakfast, and was sitting at the kitchen table with his phone and a legal pad where he'd written down what he knew and what he suspected and the gap between those two things. It was an old habit, making the invisible visible, forcing vague threat into specific shape. A listed thing was a thing you could respond to. A formless worry was just wait. What he knew. Dominic Reeves had resources and a wounded ego, which was in some ways more dangerous than a wounded body. He had at least 8 associates actively communicating. He had been humiliated in front of witnesses, filmed, and that film was now presumably in the possession of Vivian Sterling's security team, which meant it could surface in ways Dominic couldn't control. Men like Dominic didn't respond to that kind of exposure by retreating. They responded by escalating, and they escalated fast, before the story had time to settle into a shape that was permanent. What he suspected, the gray sedan from yesterday, was reconnaissance, not action. They were mapping him, his routes, his schedule, his patterns, which meant they weren't ready to move yet, but they were getting ready. What he didn't know, whether Vivian was the primary target or a secondary one, and whether they had enough information yet about Lily. That last unknown was the one that made his jaw tight. He tore the legal pad page into pieces and put them in the trash, because he wasn't the kind of man who left written things around for Lily to find. And then he went and knocked lightly on her door. Up, he said through the wood, a sound that communicated profound philosophical opposition to the concept. 20 minutes, Lily, a longer, more articulate sound. 18 minutes now. He heard the creak of her bed and went back to the kitchen to make her oatmeal, because it was cold and because she'd eat it without argument, which was the full extent of his nutritional goals on a Wednesday morning when he hadn't slept properly and was thinking about 8 individuals with phones and grudges. She came out with her hair imperfectly brushed and her uniform shirt on inside out, which she noticed and corrected without comment, and ate her oatmeal standing at the counter because sitting down implied a relationship with morning that she wasn't prepared to commit to. "You're quiet," she said. "I'm always quiet in the morning." "You're quieter than usual quiet," Lily said. "There are different kinds of quiet, and this is the kind where you're thinking about something you're not going to tell me about." Ryan looked at her. 8 years old. He was, occasionally, unsettled by her. "Donna's going to pick you up today," he said. "Not me." Lily set her spoon down. "Why?" "I've got a job that might run long." She looked at him with her mother's eyes, which saw through things the same way Claire's always had. Not accusatory, just accurate. "Is this about yesterday?" "Get your backpack," he said. "Dad." "Lily." He kept his voice even. "I need you to trust me on this one, okay? Go to school, do your thing, Donna picks you up, you come home. That's the whole plan." A long pause in which she was clearly weighing whether to push it. Then she picked up her spoon and finished her oatmeal in 4 bites, picked up her backpack from the floor, and kissed him on the jaw on her way to the door because she was too tall now to reach his cheek comfortably, and neither of them had formally acknowledged this transition. "Don't do anything stupid," she said. "I never do anything stupid," Ryan said. "That is a factually incorrect statement," Lily said, and closed the door behind her. He stood in the kitchen for a moment after she left. The drip from the faucet measured the silence in irregular intervals. He was going to fix that faucet. This week. He was going to fix it this week, and he was going to take Lily to the diner on Saturday, and he was going to get through whatever was coming in the next 48 hours without it touching her life in any way she'd have to carry afterward. He picked up his phone and called Donna. She answered on the second ring, which meant she'd been awake. I need you to pick Lily up today, he said. And if anything feels off, anything at all, I need you to take her somewhere crowded and call me immediately. Not the apartment, somewhere with people. A pause. Donna had known Ryan for 2 years. She'd watched him with Lily on good days and bad days, and the hollow, grinding days in the middle that were worse than either. She didn't ask him to explain himself. I'll have my phone on all day, she said. She okay? She's fine. Keep her that way. Go do what you need to do, Donna said, and hung up. Ryan stood at the window one more time, looking at the street in the gray early light, at the ordinary Wednesday morning assembling itself on Caldwell. A woman walking a small dog, a delivery van double parked outside the corner deli, 2 kids ahead of schedule for school moving with the particular stiff energy of children who hadn't yet fully woken up. He thought about the oath he'd made himself when he left the service. Not a formal one, nothing ceremonial, just a private promise made to a hospital room and a woman who was losing her fight, and a daughter who was going to need a father who was present and not half gone somewhere else in his head. He had kept it. For 3 years he had kept it with the same discipline he'd applied to everything else in his adult life, and the keeping of it had cost him things he'd chosen not to count. He picked up his jacket and his keys. He drove to Sterling Consolidated. He hadn't planned to, or he had planned to and hadn't admitted it to himself until he was already 2/3 of the way there, and it seemed easier to follow through than to construct a reason not to. The building was on Archer Street, a glass and steel tower that occupied half a city block and had the particular architectural confidence of a company that had been doing well for long enough to stop being shy about it. He parked across the street and was about to call the number Janet Osei had given him when his phone rang. Vivian Sterling. You're outside, she said. He looked up at the building. Cameras? Street facing, yes. A brief pause. Come up. I'll tell the lobby you're coming. The lobby was the kind of lobby that communicated things without saying them. Marble, clean lines, a security desk with 2 men behind it who looked at Ryan's worn jacket and his truck-calloused hands without expression, which was itself a kind of professionalism. One of them checked his ID, made a call, and handed him a visitor badge with the particular efficiency of people who processed a lot of visitors and had long since stopped being curious about them. The elevator opened on the 14th floor, and Janet Osei was there to meet him, a compact woman in her mid-40s with close-cropped hair and the measured, watchful quality of someone who'd spent 2 decades keeping other people safe and had learned not to assume anything about anyone. She looked him over once. He looked her over once. They understood each other. She's in the Situation Room, Janet said, and led him down a corridor. The Situation Room was a conference room that had been repurposed. 2 large monitors on one wall, a table covered with printed satellite images and what looked like phone records, 3 people Ryan didn't know working at laptops. Vivian was at the head of the table in a different blazer than yesterday, a coffee in her hand that looked like it had been there a while. She looked like she'd slept about as much as he had. She looked at him when he came in. Something in her expression simplified. Not relief exactly, more like the acknowledgement of a possibility she'd been holding at a distance. You changed your mind about the help, she said. I came to look at what you have, Ryan said. That's not the same thing. Close enough, she gestured at the table. Come look at what we have. What they had was more than he'd expected. Janet's team had spent the night pulling threads, and the picture that had assembled itself was specific in ways that a maintenance man from Caldwell Street had no particular right to be looking at. But Ryan looked at it anyway, because the alternative was operating on incomplete information, and he'd made that mistake exactly once in his life and wasn't going to make it again. Dominic Reeves was not, primarily, a neighborhood bully. That was almost incidental, a habit, a recreation, the way some men golfed on weekends. His actual business was debt enforcement for a man named Marcus Webb, whose actual business was a portfolio of loans made to small businesses at interest rates that guaranteed default, at which point Webb's people moved in and the business changed hands. It was a system that had been running for 9 years and had never come apart because the people it targeted were rarely in a position to cause trouble, and the people who might cause trouble had generally been managed. Dominic was very good at managing people. Webb is the problem, Janet said, standing beside Ryan at the table with a printed map of the Harlow commercial district marked with colored dots. Reeves is the instrument. Webb is why this escalated. Dominic called him after the cafe. Whatever happens to Reeves is a Webb decision at this point. You know Webb, Ryan said to Vivian. She was quiet for a half second. We've had dealings. A company in my portfolio, small logistics firm on the south side, was one of his targets 2 years ago. I bought the debt and cleared it before his people could move in. She looked at the map. He's had reasons to be annoyed with me before yesterday. So Dominic's humiliation gives Webb a pretext. And a motivation, Janet said. Eliminating Vivian removes an obstacle and sends a message to anyone else who's gotten in his way. Ryan looked at the map. The dots were sightings, locations where Dominic's associates had been observed or picked up on traffic cameras in the last 18 hours. The pattern was visible once you knew what you were looking at. They're not watching the building, he said. No, Janet said. They know the building is too hard. Cameras, security, controlled access. He traced a line between 3 of the dots with his finger. They're watching the route, between here and... He looked at Vivian. Where are you going tonight? She met his eyes. Something moved behind hers. The recognition that he'd already seen what her security chief was still processing. The Harlow Children's Foundation Gala, she said. Birch Hall. It's been on the calendar for 3 months. I'm a co-chair. Public event. Very. What time do you leave? 7. Ryan straightened up from the table and looked at Janet. You've already figured this out, he said. It wasn't a question. We figured it out at 4 this morning, Janet said. The question was whether to cancel the event. You can't cancel, Ryan said. Not without tipping them that you know what they're planning, and the moment they know you know, they adjust. And you don't know what they adjust to. Which is what I told her at 4:15, Janet said with a dry precision that Ryan respected. Vivian put her coffee down. So what do we do? Ryan looked at the map again. The route between Sterling Consolidated and Birch Hall ran through 3 blocks of the Harlow Warehouse District. Older streets, lower foot traffic, enough industrial architecture to provide cover for half a dozen men with bad intentions. If he were planning this, which he wasn't, it's where he would do it. You go to the event, he said. On time, normal route, normal security. Vivian raised an eyebrow. And let them hit us in the warehouse district. No, Ryan said. And let them think they're hitting you in the warehouse district while your actual car takes a different route and arrives 10 minutes early through the service entrance. Decoy, Janet said. Decoy. Your security team in the primary vehicle, marked clearly enough that anyone watching the building will identify it. Police coordination, so there are assets in position when Dominic's people make their move. Controlled environment, predictable timeline, no civilian exposure. He looked at Janet. Can you coordinate with Harlow PD in the next 8 hours without the information leaking to anyone Webb has access to? Janet looked at him with the expression of a woman who had spent 19 years in security and was recalibrating an assessment she'd made when he first walked in. I know someone at Violent Crimes who owes me a conversation, she said. Make the call, Ryan said. He spent the next 6 hours in that building. He hadn't intended to. But the plan required detail work, and he was the one who could see the detail with the most clarity, and every time he tried to hand off a piece of it and step back, there was a gap. Something the security team didn't know how to account for because they hadn't operated in spaces where this kind of thing happened. And you had to think 6 moves ahead while also thinking about what the other side was thinking about what you were thinking. He ate lunch from the building's cafeteria, a chicken sandwich and a bag of chips that he ate standing up while reviewing a map. And around 2 in the afternoon, he called Donna. Everything okay? He asked. Lily's eating a granola bar and arguing with me about whether homework counts as exercise, Donna said. She's fine. Good. He let out a breath he'd been carrying since morning. I might be late. You're always late when you say you might be late. Donna, we're fine, Ryan. Go do your thing. He went back to the map. At 4:30, Vivian came and stood beside him at the table where he'd been working through approach vectors with Janet's second-in-command, a former state trooper named Delgado, who was thorough and literal and caught 3 things Ryan had missed. You should eat something real, Vivian said. She set a container of food on the corner of the table, something from the executive dining room, an actual meal. That sandwich from the cafeteria was 4 hours ago. Ryan looked at the container, then at her. The cameras in the cafeteria too, he said. I asked someone to check on you, she said without apology. You've been in here working for 6 hours on a problem that's technically mine. It stopped being just yours when they put people outside my building, Ryan said. He looked at the food. Thank you. He ate while they talked, which was not a habit he normally had, but necessity made adaptable. Vivian sat across the corner of the table from him, not performing casualness, but genuinely settling into it, the way people do when they've been running at high tension for a long time, and a moment of relative stillness becomes something to inhabit rather than rush through. How long were you in? She asked. He glanced at her. The military, she said. Janet's contact at violent crimes ran your background this afternoon. She told me the broad strokes. I'm asking you. Ryan put his fork down. He looked at the table for a moment, not uncomfortable with the question, just deciding where to put it. 12 years, he said. Navy, last 6 years in SEAL teams. What made you leave? 2 things. He picked up the fork again. A mission that went wrong in a way I couldn't get past, and a daughter who needed a father who was actually present. He ate. Those 2 things happened close together. The mission is not a cafeteria story, he said. Not harsh, just a door with a label on it. She nodded. He appreciated, again, her willingness to accept a boundary without making it into something. Claire, she said. Your wife. He looked at her. Janet told me. I'm sorry. It's been 3 years, he said, which was the answer he gave when he didn't have a better one. It was true. It was also not the whole truth, because grief didn't have a clock, and 3 years was at the same time a long time and no time at all, depending on which version of a Tuesday you were having. Vivian didn't offer a consolation. He was grateful for that too. People who offered consolations usually did it for their own comfort. Tell me about Lily, she said instead. He looked at her, surprised by the shift. You've been worried about her all day, Vivian said. Every time your phone goes off, you check it the same way. I just thought, a slight pause, it might help to talk about her instead of about approach vectors for a few minutes. Ryan sat with that for a moment. She's 8, he said. He found himself at a loss for a second, which didn't happen often. She's smarter than I was at her age by a significant margin. She doesn't let things go. She has very strong opinions about homework policy and what constitutes a fair bedtime and why the tooth gap is an asset. He looked at the table. She's her mother in the eyes and me everywhere else, which is sometimes a lot to look at. Vivian was quiet. She was listening with the same quality she'd brought to everything else, fully, without performing it. She told me not to do anything stupid this morning, Ryan said. That tracks, Vivian said. He almost smiled, something close to it. She's going to be all right, Vivian said. Tonight. I need you to know that I understand what it costs to have her be the reason this situation concerns you, and I'm not taking that lightly. Ryan looked at her directly. I know you're not, he said. They held that for a moment. Then Delgado came back into the room with a printed update from Janet's contact at violent crimes, and the moment passed into the next part of the day. By 5:30, the plan was as solid as they could make it. Detective Aaron Briggs from Harlow PD Violent Crimes, a lean, tired man who had worked the web periphery for 3 years without ever being able to close it, had committed 4 plainclothes units to the warehouse district route, with 2 additional marked units on standby at the Birch Hall perimeter. Janet's team would run the decoy vehicle. Vivian's actual transport would leave through the building's loading dock at 6:45, take a 3-block deviation, and arrive at Birch Hall via the service entrance exactly as the main event doors opened. Ryan's role was not defined in any formal sense. He'd made that clear. He wasn't law enforcement, and he wasn't hired security, and the last thing anyone needed was a civilian creating a liability in a police operation. He drove to Donna's apartment at 5:50 and sat in the truck for a moment before going up. Lily was at Donna's kitchen table doing homework, the real kind, math, not the gratitude assignment. She looked up when he came in and assessed him with the quick efficiency of a child who had learned to read the temperature of a room and the temperature of a person before she was 4 years old. You look tired, she said. I'm fine. You also look like something happened. Nothing happened, he said. I'm taking you home. She packed her things without argument, which was its own kind of signal. She knew when to push and when to leave it, and right now she was leaving it. He thanked Donna, who pressed his hand briefly and didn't ask, and he took Lily downstairs to the truck. They were 2 blocks from home when his phone rang. Janet. Change of plan, she said, and her voice had the particular tightened quality of someone managing new information fast. "We have eyes on a second vehicle we didn't identify before. Dark blue pickup, 3 occupants, different pattern from the warehouse district watchers. They've been moving in a radius around Sterling Consolidated, but in the last 20 minutes they shifted." A pause. "They're in your neighborhood, Ryan." He looked at Lily, who was looking out the window at the evening city, her backpack in her lap. "How close?" he said, his voice unchanged. "Corner of Vine and 19th, 4 blocks from your building. They stopped." The truck was at a red light on Morrison. Ryan looked at the intersection ahead, at the route home, at Lily's reflection in the passenger window. The light turned green. He took a left instead of a right. Lily looked at him. "This isn't the way home." "I know." "Dad." "Lily." He kept his voice level. "I need you to stay calm and trust me for about 10 minutes. She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face that was too old for 8 years old and broke his heart a little, the way it always did when he saw it. She turned back to the window. "Okay," she said quietly. He called Donna from the truck and told her to go to her sister's place for the night. Don't argue, take what she needed for one night and go. Donna, who had her own particular intelligence about when not to argue, said she'd be gone in 20 minutes. Then he called Janet back. "Lily's in the car with me," he said. "I need a secure drop-off point, somewhere public, monitored, where I can leave her with someone I trust while I figure out what those 3 people on Vine Street are actually there for." "I have a solution for that," Janet said, and there was a careful quality to her voice that he understood meant Vivian had already thought about this contingency. "Birch Hall, event starting in 40 minutes. There are 200 people and 3 layers of security and a private room on the 2nd floor. Lily would be with event staff and building security." Ryan looked at his daughter. She was watching him. "Lily," he said, and his voice came out slightly rougher than he intended. "How do you feel about a fancy party?" She looked at him with the expression of someone who understood that the question was not really about a fancy party. "Will you be there?" she asked. "For a little while," he said, "and then I have to go deal with something, but you'll be safe, and I'll come back." She was quiet for a long beat. "Promise?" she said. Not dramatic, just a real question, the kind children ask when they've already learned that some promises are more complicated than others. "I promise," Ryan said. He'd made that promise before. He intended to keep it the same way he always had. Not because keeping it was guaranteed, but because the making of it was the most honest thing he could offer her, and she deserved his honesty more than she deserved his silence. He drove to Birch Hall. The event was already receiving its first guests when Ryan pulled up to the service entrance, where a young woman in a headset was waiting, efficient, unfazed, clearly briefed, and took Lily with the practiced ease of someone who'd managed corporate children at events before. Lily went without protest, which cost her. He could see it, but she went. She looked back at him once from the doorway. He held up 2 fingers, a signal they'd had since she was 5, their version of "I see you, I'm here." And she turned and went inside. Ryan stood in the service alley for a moment. Then he put his jacket on properly, checked his phone one final time, and walked back toward the street. He was 3 buildings down from Birch Hall, moving through the service alley that ran parallel to the main road, when he heard them. Not voices, movement. The particular sound of people trying to be quiet who weren't quite good enough at it. From the direction of the building's east side, where the street-level parking gave way to a loading area, 2 men were moving along the wall with the specific economy of people who had a plan and a timeline. Ryan stopped. He processed the information as it came in. 2 men here, which meant the third from the blue pickup was somewhere else. Somewhere covering an exit, or covering the front, or... And this was the calculation that moved fastest through him. Monitoring the point where Vivian's legitimate car would arrive. Separate from wherever Dominic's main unit was positioned in the warehouse district. This was not the decoy operation. This was a separate arm of it, a backup, or a contingency, or, most likely, a parallel track. Webb's planning, not Dominic's. Dominic was the hammer. This was something more precise. They were here for Vivian, not as a secondary target. She was the primary. He called Janet in a single breath. "Second team at Birch Hall East Side. 2 confirmed, 1 probable covering. This is not the warehouse operation. This is separate. Webb's people." A half-second of silence. "Vivian's en route," Janet said. 6 minutes out." I need those 6 minutes, Ryan said, and pocketed the phone. He moved along the service alley with the particular quality of motion that left no sound behind it. Something that had once been trained and was now simply what he was in his body. The way a language learned young never fully becomes foreign. He came around the corner of the loading dock with his hands visible and his movements unhurried, because the worst thing you could do when approaching armed men in a dark alley was move like you were afraid of them, and Ryan Mercer had not been afraid of a dark alley in a very long time. The first man heard him at 2 meters and turned. Ryan was already inside that distance. What followed lasted approximately 8 seconds and involved no particular drama, no combat movie choreography, no speeches, nothing that would look good on film. Just two men who had been positioned in a dark alley who found themselves on the ground in rapid succession, disarmed, their phones gone, zip-tied with the cable ties Ryan kept in his jacket pocket because they had about 100 professional uses, and occasionally this one. The third man was at the east corner of the building, monitoring the street. He heard something, maybe the sound of the second man hitting the ground, maybe some instinct, and turned and found Ryan already there. This one was faster. He went for something at his waist, and Ryan's left hand came down on the reaching arm with a force that ended the reach. And then it was the same sequence, controlled, efficient, no wasted motion. And the third man was on his knees against the wall, his phone on the ground, Ryan's hand on the back of his collar. The other team, Ryan said. Warehouse district. How many? The man said nothing. Ryan increased the pressure at a specific point at the back of the man's collar, which was not pleasant. 5, the man said. Are they moving yet? A pause. Are they moving? Ryan said again. They moved when we moved, the man said. Coordinated. When we signaled, Ryan was already calling Janet. Warehouse team is moving now, he said. Coordinated signal with the Birch Hall team. Your decoy vehicle is the target. Briggs is already on them, Janet said, and he could hear controlled urgency in her voice. 4 units in position? We're good? A brief pause. Birch Hall team? Down, Ryan said. Need police at the east service entrance. A longer pause. Are you hurt? Janet asked. No. Vivian is 2 minutes out, she said. Ryan, thank you. He didn't say anything to that. He stood in the service alley with his hand on the third man's collar and the sounds of the city going about its business on the other side of the building wall and waited for the sirens, which came, as they usually did, a little later than you wanted them and a little faster than you expected. The police arrived in 4 minutes, 2 units, then a third. Briggs came himself, Ryan would learn that later, from the warehouse operation, which had gone cleanly, all 5 men in custody before they'd gotten within a block of the decoy vehicle. Ryan gave his statement to a young officer who wrote in a notebook with a deliberate care that suggested he was trying very hard to get the details right. And Ryan answered every question accurately and without embellishment, because accurate information was what a police report needed, and embellishment was what it didn't. He asked once if he could step away to make a call, and the officer said yes. He called Donna, who was at her sister's, and fine. Then he went inside through the service entrance and up to the second floor and knocked on the door of the private room where Lily was sitting in a chair too large for her, eating crackers from a catering tray and watching something on a tablet that the event staff had found for her. She looked up when the door opened. She looked at him the way she always looked at him when he came back from something. A quick inventory top to bottom, checking for the things he wouldn't tell her about. Apparently satisfied, she held up the tablet. They have a documentary about deep-sea creatures, she said. Did you know there are fish that make their own light? I did know that, Ryan said. Why didn't you tell me? He sat down in the chair beside her. His hands were steady. His shoulder was going to ache tomorrow. He'd caught an edge somewhere in the alley and hadn't registered it at the time. He'd ice it later. I thought you'd find it on your own, he said. Lily considered this. That's a very passive parenting approach. I encourage independent discovery. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she turned back to the tablet and tilted it slightly toward him so he could see the screen too. They sat like that for a while, father and daughter in a room above a gala. Neither of them was dressed for, watching fish make light in the dark deep of the ocean. And the sounds from downstairs drifted up through the floor. Music, voices, the clink of glasses. 100 people doing the ordinary work of being alive in a city that was having, for most of them, A completely unremarkable Wednesday evening. Ryan watched the screen. He did not feel like a hero. He felt like a man with a sore shoulder and a daughter who was eating the last of the crackers, and a promise he'd kept by a margin that he was going to think about carefully when he had more sleep and more distance and more time to sit with what that margin meant. Vivian Sterling arrived at Birch Hall at 7:12 through the service entrance, her charcoal blazer exchanged for something appropriate to a gala, and she walked through the event with the composure of a woman who had been managing difficult evenings since long before this one. But before she went into the main hall, she came to the second floor. She stood in the doorway of the private room and looked at Ryan and then at Lily and then at the documentary on the tablet, and she didn't say anything for a moment. "You're Lily," she said finally. Lily looked at her. "You're the woman from the cafe," she said. Vivian blinked. Then she looked at Ryan. "I told you she was sharp," he said. "You didn't actually tell me anything about her," Vivian said. "Then I'm telling you now." Vivian looked at Lily again, with the particular look of a person who was meeting someone they hadn't expected to be moved by, and finding themselves moved anyway. "Your father kept a lot of people safe tonight," she said. Lily looked at the tablet, then at Vivian, then at Ryan, with the measured consideration of someone taking an accurate reading. "He usually does," she said, without fanfare. Ryan looked at the floor. Outside, the city was doing what it always did, relentless, full of its own concerns. And somewhere in it, Marcus Webb was about to get a phone call about a very bad evening. And somewhere else, Dominic Reeves was sitting with the slow understanding that the thing he'd thought was a solution had become something else entirely. But Ryan was not thinking about any of that. He was sitting in a chair beside his daughter in a room above a gala, and his shoulder ached, and she'd eaten all the crackers, and the fish on the screen were making their own cold light in the dark. And for the moment, which was all any moment ever was, everyone he loved was in the same room as he was. The shoulder was worse in the morning. Ryan had iced it the night before. A bag of frozen peas wrapped in a dish towel, 20 minutes on and 20 off, while Lily slept, and the apartment settled into its nighttime quiet. But it had stiffened in his sleep the way injuries always did when you were past 30, and had accumulated enough of them that they started keeping records. He stood at the bathroom mirror at 6:15 and rotated his arms slowly, mapping the damage. Nothing torn. A deep bruise along the deltoid where he'd caught the edge of the loading dock wall, and a tightness in the joint that would be a problem for about a week, and then wouldn't be. He'd had worse. He made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and read the news on his phone, which was something he rarely did but felt necessary this morning. The Harlow Courier had a brief piece about an operation by violent crimes that had resulted in 8 arrests and the seizure of 2 firearms in what the department spokesperson described as a coordinated law enforcement response to a credible threat. No names, no mention of Birch Hall or Sterling Consolidated. Detective Briggs, who had struck Ryan as a man who understood the value of a managed narrative, had apparently framed the operation in a way that kept the connective tissue invisible. Ryan put his phone down and drank his coffee. He was thinking about Marcus Webb. The 8 arrests were real, and the charges would stick. Janet's team had given Briggs documentation that made the evidentiary picture clean, but Webb himself hadn't been touched. Webb was never touched directly. That was how he'd operated for 9 years, and one bad night for his enforcement arm wasn't going to change the architecture of how he ran his business. He would absorb the loss, replace the personnel, and recalibrate. The question was whether he would recalibrate in a direction that still pointed at Vivian, or whether the cost-benefit had shifted enough that she became not worth the continued exposure. Ryan didn't know the answer to that. It depended on things he didn't have full visibility into. How much Webb's pride was invested, how much money was actually at stake, whether there were other pressure points in his operation that Vivian represented. He realized he was thinking about it the way he used to think about problems in the teams, mapping what he knew against what he didn't, running probabilities, building contingencies. He recognized the mode and noted it, and chose not to feel a particular way about it. Lily came out at 7, slightly more awake than usual, which she attributed to the crackers from last night apparently being very good crackers. "Gala crackers are different from regular crackers," she said, getting her cereal. "How so?" "They taste like someone cared about them," she said, which Ryan thought was either a very deep observation or a very funny one, and possibly both. He drove her to school himself. He watched her go in through the main entrance, watched the door close behind her, and sat in the truck for an extra minute before pulling away. His phone rang at 8:40 while he was on the highway. Vivian. "How's the shoulder?" she said. He'd forgotten about the shoulder by the time he left Birch Hall. He must have shown it somewhere, in some small way. "Fine," he said. "Janet said you caught the loading dock. Janet's thorough. That's why I pay her." A brief pause, and in it he could hear the sound of her office, the low ambient hum of a building that was already fully in motion at 8:40 on a Thursday morning. "I want to talk to you, in person, not about security, not about web, just, I'd like to talk to you." Ryan looked at the highway ahead of him. He had 3 jobs today: a leaky radiator pipe in an apartment on Grant Street, a door frame repair in the West Side Commercial District, and a commercial refrigerator unit in a restaurant kitchen that had been making a noise described by the owner as like a dying cat, but angrier. "I've got jobs today," he said. "I know. I'm not asking you to clear your schedule." Another pause. "There's a diner on Clement Street called Polly's. Do you know it?" "I know it." 6 o'clock? After you're done. I'll be the one without a toolbox." He was quiet for a moment. "Okay," he said. He fixed the radiator pipe on Grant Street, which turned out to be less a leak and more a slow catastrophic failure of a joint that had been painted over approximately 4 times, and was now held together by optimism and mineral deposits. He fixed the door frame in the West Side Commercial District, which took an hour and a half, and required a conversation with the building super about why the frame had warped in the first place that the super did not enjoy having. The restaurant refrigerator was indeed making a sound like a dying cat, but angrier, which turned out to be a failing compressor fan that he replaced in 40 minutes, while the kitchen staff worked around him with the practiced indifference of people who had long ago decided that maintenance was someone else's problem until it wasn't. He finished at 5:20, cleaned up in the restaurant bathroom, and drove to Clement Street. Polly's was a corner diner of the old school, counter seating, vinyl booths, a menu laminated to the table, coffee that came automatically when you sat down. The kind of place that had been in the same location for so long it had become part of the neighborhood's self-image. Ryan liked it because they didn't look at you when you came in alone, and they didn't rush you when you sat. Vivian was in a booth near the back. She'd changed from her office clothes into something less formal, dark jeans, a simple gray sweater, and she had both hands around a coffee cup that she'd clearly been waiting over for a little while. She looked up when he came in, and her expression did the thing he'd noticed it doing, that brief simplified honesty, before she reassembled whatever version of herself she was presenting. He sat down across from her. The waitress materialized with coffee before he'd taken his jacket off. "Thank you for coming," Vivian said. "You said it wasn't about security," Ryan said. "It isn't." "Or web." "It isn't." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "I've been thinking about how to start this conversation since this morning, and I haven't landed on a good way, so I'm just going to start in the middle of it." "Okay." "I had Janet pull your full file," she said. "Not for security purposes. After last night, when I knew you and Lily were safe and the operation was done, I sat in my office and She stopped, restarted. "I needed to understand who you are, not the maintenance contractor from Caldwell Street, not the SEAL, just who you are, as a complete picture. And I know that's an intrusion, and I'm not asking you to be comfortable with it. I'm just being honest about it." Ryan looked at her across the table. He should have been annoyed. He was aware that he should have been annoyed and noted that he wasn't, particularly, and set that aside to examine later. "What did you find?" he said. She took a breath. Ryan Thomas Mercer, 37 years old, born in Kettering, Ohio. Father was a machinist, mother taught elementary school. Enlisted at 22, Annapolis before that on an ROTC scholarship. Graduated in the top 8% of his class. 12 years Navy, last 6 in SEAL teams, specializing in maritime counterterrorism and hostage rescue. She wasn't reading, she'd committed it. 4 deployments. Multiple commendations. Then a mission in November, 11 years ago, that's classified at a level Janet's contact couldn't access, and a medical separation 6 months later, and then nothing from the official record until a business license for Mercer General Maintenance, LLC, filed 3 years ago in Harlow. She paused. "And Claire?" Ryan was quiet. "Claire Mercer, née Bateman, 34 at time of death. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed 8 months before she died. Lily was 5. Vivian's voice was even, but the evenness was the kind that took effort. I'm sorry, Ryan. I mean that simply. I know you do, he said. The diner moved around them, the counter filling up with the afterwork crowd, the waitress moving efficiently between tables, someone at the back laughing at something on their phone. The ordinary ongoing noise of a city evening, indifferent and constant. The mission, Ryan said finally. The classified one. Vivian looked at him. I'll tell you, he said, not because your file asked for it, because you've been straight with me since a cafe on 5th Street, and I think you've earned a straight answer. She didn't say anything. She just waited. He looked at his coffee. He'd told this story twice in his life, once to a debriefer at the Naval Medical Center in Portsmouth, once to Claire, in the particular honest dark of 3 in the morning when she'd asked him directly why he flinched sometimes when doors closed too fast. He'd found both times that the telling of it was less about the words than about who was listening. We were running a hostage extraction in a port facility, he said. 6 hostages, 3 of them American nationals. Intel said the facility was lightly guarded on the east side. The intel was wrong. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. Not wrong by accident. Someone had fed us the wrong picture deliberately. We came in through the east side and walked into a prepared position. 2 of my teammates were killed in the first 90 seconds. A third was badly wounded. He paused. We got 4 of the 6 hostages out. The other 2, another pause, shorter, we couldn't get to in time. Vivian was looking at him with an expression he couldn't fully categorize, not pity, which he would have recognized and bristled at, but something more like the acknowledgement that a specific weight exists and is heavy without trying to lift it for him or tell him it wasn't as heavy as it felt. Did they ever find who fed the bad intel? She asked. Officially? No. He drank his coffee. Unofficially, there were strong suspicions about a contracted intelligence intermediary who disappeared from the record about 3 months after the mission, which is its own kind of answer. You couldn't go back after that, Vivian said. I went back for 6 more months, Ryan said. That was a mistake. I was functional, but I was not all the way there, in the way that mattered. And then Claire got diagnosed and I had a daughter who needed me to be actually present. And that was the real answer to the question I'd been asking myself for 6 months, which was why I was still doing something that I no longer trusted the way I needed to trust it to do it right. Vivian was quiet for a moment. So you came to Harlow, she said. Claire had family here. We talked about it before she got sick. A slower pace, a real neighborhood, a place where Lily could know people and not just addresses. He looked at the table. We didn't get to do it the way we planned, but I did it anyway, because it was still the right place. Vivian turned her coffee cup in her hand slowly. Outside the window, Clement Street was doing its evening thing. Storefronts lit, people moving at the unhurried pace of people who were done with their day and hadn't started their night yet. Can I tell you something about myself? She said. Go ahead. I started Sterling Consolidated with $200,000 borrowed from my mother, who took a second mortgage on her house to do it and never told my father because he would have said it was a bad idea. She looked at the cup. It took me 4 years to pay her back, and I've never once made a business decision without thinking about that mortgage. Not because I feel guilty. She offered, and she was right to offer, but because it meant something about what I owe to the thing I built, about taking it seriously. She looked up at him. I tell you that because I want you to understand that when I talk to you about the work you did, in the cafe, at Birch Hall, all of it, I'm not talking about it as a transaction. I'm talking about it as someone who understands what it costs to do something that matters. Ryan looked at her. Okay, he said. I'm establishing a foundation, she said. I've been thinking about it for a while, but this week clarified the shape of it for me. Veterans employment, not charity, placement, training, professional development. Building a bridge between what people who've served actually know how to do and the industries that need people who know how to do it. Construction, logistics, security, project management, all of it. She held his eyes. I want you to run it. He didn't respond immediately. Not as a favor, she said quickly. Not as a thank you. I've watched you think for 3 days, and the way you think, the operational clarity, the people management, the ability to hold multiple tracks simultaneously, is exactly what that kind of organization needs in its leadership. I fix things for a living, Ryan said. Yes, she said. You do. And you're good at it, and it pays your bills and it's honest work, and I'm not diminishing any of that. She leaned forward slightly. But I've also watched you run a coordinated security operation from a conference table with 8 hours' notice, and neutralize 3 armed men in a service alley without injuring any of them beyond what was necessary, and keep your head completely clear through all of it, while simultaneously managing your daughter's safety and keeping everyone around you informed and functional. She paused. Ryan, you're not a maintenance contractor who used to be something else. You're someone who chose a particular shape of life for specific and honorable reasons, and I respect those reasons. I'm asking whether those reasons leave room for this. Ryan looked at the table. He thought about the legal pad with the threat assessment he'd written and torn up. He thought about Lily saying that's a very passive parenting approach, with the gap-toothed precision of someone who had inherited 2 people's best qualities and was figuring out what to do with them. He thought about the kitchen faucet on Caldwell Street that still needed fixing, and the 3 jobs he had tomorrow, and the particular grinding arithmetic of making a life work on margins that didn't leave much room for error. He thought about the 2 men he hadn't been able to get to in time, 11 years ago in a port facility where the intel was wrong. I'd need to understand the full scope, he said. What you actually want it to do, not just the concept. Vivian reached into her bag and put a folder on the table between them. It was about a 1/4 inch thick, not a full business plan, but more than a back-of-napkin idea. She'd been working on this. He picked it up. You've been working on this for longer than 3 days, he said. 6 weeks, she said. The cafe was a coincidence. The foundation was already happening. She paused. Although the cafe did clarify some things about the leadership profile I was looking for. He looked at her over the folder. She had the faintest trace of something at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, more like the outline of one. He opened the folder and read. She let him read. She didn't fill the silence with elaboration or sell him on the things he was reading, which he noted and appreciated. She drank her coffee and watched the street through the window and left him alone with the material. It was thoughtfully constructed. Not perfect. There were gaps in the program design for reintegration support that would need addressing, and the funding model had some assumptions baked in that struck him as optimistic, but the core architecture was sound. The mission was specific without being narrow. She'd thought about the population she was trying to serve with a clarity that didn't come from press release language, but from someone who had actually spent time with the problem. He turned the last page and closed the folder. The transition support model is thin, he said. I know. Veterans coming out of service who are struggling with reintegration aren't just going to need job placement. They're going to need, he thought about how to say it, a period where someone is paying attention to how they're actually doing. Not a hotline, an actual human being who checks in. I agree, Vivian said. That's a gap I knew about and didn't know how to fill. I know some people, he said, former teammates, a couple of people from VA services, a woman who runs a program in Pittsburgh that's been doing this well for 4 years. If they were part of building the model, it would be more honest. Vivian was looking at him with an attention that was different from the assessment she'd had in the cafe or the focused crisis attention of the situation room. This was something quieter. You're talking about building it, she said, not evaluating it. He looked at the folder. I haven't said yes, he said. No, she agreed. You haven't. He was quiet for a moment. A couple slid into the booth beside them, talking about something that had nothing to do with anything, the ordinary texture of other people's lives. Lily would have questions, Ryan said. I imagined she would. I would need to talk to her before anything was official. She's got a stake in how my work affects our life. She's 8, Vivian said, not dismissively. More like she was confirming she understood the weight he was giving it. She's 8 and she told me not to do anything stupid, and she was right, Ryan said. She has a stake. Something crossed Vivian's face, something he couldn't name with complete accuracy, something that was about more than the conversation they were having. Okay, she said. Ryan's phone buzzed on the table. He looked at it. Lily, via Donna, who relayed messages when Lily felt the situation was urgent enough to warrant proxy communication. Tell Dad that Mrs. Garfield liked the teeth essay. He turned the phone face down on the table. Good news? Vivian asked. My daughter submitted an essay about her gap-toothed smile for a Thanksgiving gratitude assignment, and her teacher apparently approved of it. Vivian looked at him with an expression that was navigating something internal. She's something, Vivian said. Yes, Ryan said simply. They ordered food. Ryan got the turkey sandwich. Vivian got soup that she ate about half of before pushing the bowl aside the way people did when they were thinking harder than they were hungry. The conversation moved, the way conversations do when the formal reason for them has been handled and what's left is the actual texture of two people talking. Ryan's childhood in Kettering, which had been unremarkable in ways he'd come to appreciate. Vivian's mother's house in South Harlow, where she still had Sunday dinners when the week allowed it. Small things, real things. He found himself talking about Claire in a way he rarely did. Not the death, not the illness, but Claire as she'd actually been, specific and irreducible. Her opinion that the best sandwiches had exactly 4 components, and any more was hubris. Her habit of narrating her own thought process out loud when she was trying to solve something. The way she'd been able to make Lily laugh from across a room with a single look. Vivian listened the way she listened to everything, fully, without filling in the gaps. She sounds like someone who took up exactly the amount of space she was supposed to, Vivian said. Ryan looked at his plate. Yeah, he said. That's right. It was close to 8:30 when they left Polly's. The evening had turned cold in the way Harlow evenings turned cold in November, fast and thorough, no equivocation. Ryan held the door and they stood on Clement Street in the cold dark, and there was a moment that had a particular quality to it, not awkward, not charged, just honest. I'll think about it, Ryan said. The folder was under his arm. That's all I asked, Vivian said. It wasn't all you asked, but it's what you're getting right now. She looked at him with the trace of a smile again. Fair. He nodded. She nodded. He started toward his truck and he was almost to the corner when she called after him. Ryan. He turned. The cafe, she said. Yesterday morning. I've been thinking about it all week, and I keep coming back to the same thing. She stood on the Clement Street sidewalk with her hands in her jacket pockets and the cold making her breath visible. You didn't stand up because you knew you could win. You stood up because it was the right thing and you didn't ask the room's permission first. She paused. I haven't seen that in a long time. Ryan stood on the sidewalk. Most people, he said, just need someone else to go first. He turned and walked to his truck. He was home by 9. Donna had Lily in pajamas at the kitchen table doing what appeared to be a detailed illustrated diagram of deep-sea fish, her notebook open, colored pencils out, the particular focused energy of a child who had found a new obsession and was following it with full commitment. There are fish called viper fish, Lily said, without looking up from the drawing, that have teeth so big they can't close their mouths. Their teeth are longer than their heads. I know, Ryan said. How do you know? I was in the ocean a few times. Lily looked up. In the part with the viper fish? Hopefully not. She looked at him with the evaluating look, then at the folder under his arm. What's that? Something I'm thinking about, he said. I'll tell you about it this weekend. Sit-down conversation. She studied him for a moment, the colored pencil hovering over her notebook. Is it a good something or a complicated something? Probably both, Ryan said. She accepted this and went back to her viperfish. He thanked Donna and saw her out, and then stood in the kitchen making the kind of tea he only made when he was going to be up for a while, his mind running quietly through the contents of the folder, the conversation at Polly's, the particular shape of the week that had started with a dripping faucet and a gas station coffee, and a decision he'd made in a cafe without stopping to consider all its consequences. He thought about the men in his teams who had come out the other side of service and found their footing, and the ones who hadn't, and the gap between those two outcomes that wasn't about character or strength, but about whether there had been anyone paying attention during the crossing. He thought about the Pittsburgh program. He'd followed its results for 2 years without ever formally engaging with it, the way you followed something that mattered from a distance because you weren't ready to be close to it yet. He thought about what Vivian had said. You're someone who chose a particular shape of life for specific and honorable reasons. He sat at the kitchen table with his tea and Lily's colored pencils scattered around him and the city outside doing its late-night thing, and he opened the folder again. He read until midnight. He didn't make any decisions that night. He'd learned, after years of making decisions under pressure, that the decisions made slowly were often the ones that held. But he marked 3 pages with a pencil. The gaps, the places where the program design could be strengthened, the note about transition support that he'd need to think about carefully. And when he finally closed the folder and went to bed, It was with the particular quality of mind that he associated not with peace, exactly, but with problems that had been properly identified and were now ready to be worked. He slept for 6 hours. The shoulder ached. He slept through it. In the morning, Lily showed him the viperfish diagram at breakfast. It was technically impressive for an 8-year-old, which is to say that the proportions were ambitious and the teeth were perhaps even larger than accurate, which she defended. Artistic license, she said. They're twice the size of the fish's body, Ryan said. I'm emphasizing the relevant feature. He ate his oatmeal and looked at the folder on the counter. The woman from the café, he said. Ms. Sterling, she's offered me a job. Lily put her spoon down. What kind of job? Running a program that helps veterans find work after they leave the military. Lily was quiet for a moment, looking at the table with the considering look. Is it a good program? It could be. It needs work. Would you be good at it? Ryan looked at his oatmeal. I think I might be. Do you want to do it? He looked at her. She was asking with a directness that had nothing performative in it. She wasn't asking to hear a particular answer. She was asking because she actually wanted to know. I'm thinking about it, he said. She picked up her spoon. Well, she said, with the particular 8-year-old pragmatism that occasionally made him feel like she was about 40 years old, you should do it if you want to do it. We'll figure out the rest. He looked at her. Just like that, he said. You always figure out the rest, she said. That's kind of your thing. He drank his coffee. Something moved through him that he didn't have a precise name for. Not pride, not relief, something quieter and more specific than either. The particular feeling of being known accurately by someone who had no reason to be generous about it, but was anyway. Outside, Harlow was assembling another cold November morning. 2 days since the café, since the moment Dominic Reeves had walked across a room toward a woman sitting alone, and a man in a worn jacket had stood up from a corner table and quietly changed the shape of the next week for everyone involved. Detective Briggs called at 9:15. Ryan was in the truck, already headed to the Grant Street follow-up. Webb's lawyer was at the precinct at 8 this morning, Briggs said. No charges against Webb directly. Nothing we could make stick with what we have. But the 8 associates are facing serious time, and Webb knows we're watching now. My read is he pulls back for a while. For a while, Ryan said. Probably 6 months, maybe a year before he restructures. But the immediate threat to Ms. Sterling is significantly reduced. A pause. Reeves is a separate matter. He's looking at assault charges from the café and conspiracy charges from the gala operation. His lawyer will bargain some of that down, but he's not going to be a problem in any operational sense for the foreseeable future. Good, Ryan said. I want to ask you something, Briggs said. Okay, the 3 men at Birch Hall, the zip-tie restraints. I had them in my jacket pocket, Ryan said. A pause that contained its own particular quality. Maintenance contractor. They have 100 professional uses, Ryan said. Another pause. Right, Briggs said. You have my number. Ryan put the phone in the cup holder. The cup holder he still hadn't fixed, and drove toward Grant Street. He thought about Vivian, about the folder, about the Pittsburgh program, and the people he knew who might be willing to help build something that was actually honest about what veterans needed when they came out the other side. He thought about the oath he'd made himself when he left the service, the promise to step back from that life and be present for Lily instead, and whether accepting Vivian's offer violated it or honored it, and he turned that question over carefully the way you turned something over when you needed to know which side was which before you acted. The oath had been about violence, he decided, about not using what he knew for its own sake, not carrying it into spaces where it didn't belong. It had been about choosing fatherhood over the version of himself that had been built for a particular purpose. Running a Veterans Employment Foundation wasn't that version of himself. It was, possibly, the next one. He parked in front of the Grant Street building and sat for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and sent a text to the number Vivian had given him. I have questions about the transition support gap. Can we talk tomorrow? The reply came in 40 seconds. Yes, same diner, 8:30. He put the phone away, picked up his toolbox, and went to fix the radiator pipe that had needed more attention than the first visit had resolved. It was, in the end, the kind of work he understood. Finding the thing that was broken, identifying what it actually needed rather than what was quick, and doing the job right the first time so it held. The questions about the transition support gap took 3 meetings to work through properly. Not because the answers were complicated exactly, but because Ryan had spent enough time around programs that failed, government programs, nonprofit programs, well-funded initiatives that looked right on paper and fell apart on contact with actual human beings, to know that the questions themselves had to be precise before the answers were worth anything. You couldn't build a structure on approximate foundations and expect it to hold. That was true of radiator pipes, and it was true of people. The first meeting was at Polly's, 8:30, as agreed. Ryan came with 3 pages of handwritten notes, and Vivian came with 2 of her program directors, which he hadn't expected but adapted to quickly. The program directors, a woman named Renata, who had a background in workforce development, and a quiet, efficient man named Sterling, who was not related to Vivian and had long since made peace with the coincidence, were both competent, both direct, and both visibly uncertain about Ryan in the way that people were uncertain about someone who didn't fit a recognizable professional profile. By the end of that first meeting, they had stopped being uncertain. Ryan had spent 12 years being evaluated by people whose assessments had life or death consequences. And he'd learned early that the most effective way to establish credibility in a room was not to explain yourself, but to demonstrate that you understood the problem better than the people who'd been paid to understand it. He asked Renata 7 questions about the existing workforce development models she'd studied, and she answered 5 of them fully, and 2 of them with a slight hesitation that told him exactly where the gaps were. He wasn't doing it to catch her. He was doing it to map the terrain. After the meeting, walking to their cars in the cold, Renata fell into step beside him. "You've done this before," she said. "Not the foundation work, but this kind of assessment." "Different context," Ryan said. "Similar process," she said. "Where do you actually want to start?" He liked her after that. The second meeting was at the Sterling Consolidated Conference Room, without Vivian present, which was her deliberate choice. She'd told Ryan over the phone that she thought he'd work more freely without her in the room, and she was right, which he noted and chose not to examine too carefully. He came with a contact from Pittsburgh, a woman named Dr. Patricia Malone, who had built the transition support model he'd been following for 2 years. A small, precise person with the particular energy of someone who had fought for resources for so long that she now moved with a permanent slight forward lean, like someone always about to make a case. She and Renata liked each other within 20 minutes, which Ryan took as a good sign, because people with genuine expertise in overlapping areas either clicked or didn't, and you couldn't manufacture the click. Dr. Malone's model was built around what she called anchored check-ins. Not a hotline, not a drop-in, not a weekly group session, but a designated person assigned to each program participant for the first 18 months. Someone whose job was to know enough about that specific individual to notice when something was off and respond before it became a crisis. It was labor-intensive and it resisted scaling, which was why most programs didn't do it. And it was the reason her 4-year results were 20 percentage points better than comparable programs nationally. "You can't outsource the attention," she said at one point, and the room was quiet in the particular way rooms got quiet when something had been named accurately. Ryan wrote it down. The third meeting was smaller, so just him and Vivian back at Polly's on a Thursday evening 2 weeks after the first one. The Foundation's operating framework had taken shape in the interval, real shape, the kind with specifics attached. Ryan spread 4 pages of revised program design across the diner table and walked her through it section by section, not performing confidence but genuinely clear, the way he got when a problem had been fully mapped, and the path through it was visible. Vivian listened. She asked 3 questions, each one at the precise point where he'd expected a question, which confirmed what he'd already suspected, that she'd read the material he'd sent, not cursorily, but carefully. "The transition support staffing," she said when he finished. "You're proposing hiring veterans to run it, not counselors." "Counselors as a resource, not as the primary point of contact," Ryan said. "The check-ins work because the person doing them has been where the participant is. That's the thing you can't replicate with credentials." "It's a harder hire," she said. "Yes, it's a better program." She looked at the pages on the table. Then she looked at him. "When can you start?" she said. He'd been sitting with the answer to that question for 2 weeks, not because he was uncertain, but because he wanted to be sure the certainty was real, and not just the momentum of a situation carrying him somewhere he hadn't consciously chosen. That was a thing he'd watched happen to other people, and to himself once or twice when he was younger. The feeling of a decision being made by the accumulated weight of events rather than by you, and the particular hollowness that followed it. This wasn't that. January, he said. I've got clients I've been with for 2 years. I'm not going to hand them a piece of paper in December and wish them luck. I'll refer them properly, make sure they have someone good, and I'll start in January. Vivian nodded. No argument, no counterproposal, no attempt to accelerate the timeline for her own convenience. He'd noticed, over the past 2 weeks, that she didn't do that. Didn't push at the edges of agreements once they were made. It was a quality he'd encountered rarely enough that he'd stopped taking it for granted. January, she said. He picked up the papers. His coffee had gone cold during the walkthrough, which was a recurring problem in his life. There's one more thing, he said. She waited. The foundation needs a name that means something to the people it's serving, not a brand name, something with weight. He looked at the table. I want to call it the Bridgeline Foundation, because the work is about the crossing, the gap between who someone was in service and who they're going to be after. The bridge is the part nobody builds for them. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Bridgeline, she said, as if hearing how it sat. If you have something else in mind, no, she said. That's right. That's what it should be called. He nodded. She nodded. The waitress appeared with fresh coffee for both of them, unbidden, the way she always did, and Ryan decided that Polly's had earned a permanent place in his routine. The formal announcement of the Bridgeline Foundation came on a Tuesday in mid-December, at a press event in the Sterling Consolidated lobby that Ryan attended, in a jacket that was newer than the worn one, but made of similar material, because he'd tried on the thing Vivian's assistant had suggested and felt like a costume. Vivian gave a brief statement. Ryan gave a shorter one. He said what the foundation was for, what it was going to do, and what it was not going to do, in plain language, without notes. A reporter from the Harlow Courier asked him how he'd come to be involved with Sterling Consolidated, and he said he'd met Ms. Sterling through a mutual situation earlier in the fall, and they'd found they had compatible ideas about what the city needed. The reporter, who had done some background, pressed, Is it true you intervened in an altercation involving Miss Sterling at a cafe on 5th Street in November? A man was bothering someone, Ryan said. I asked him to stop. And the events at Birch Hall. I think the question is what the Bridgeline Foundation is going to do for veterans in Harlow, Ryan said. I'm happy to answer questions about that. The reporter sat back in her seat. Vivian, beside him, said nothing and kept her face neutral, but he caught the edge of the trace of a smile, and he looked away from it before it could become something he'd have to account for. The charges against Dominic Reeves were settled in early January: assault, conspiracy to commit assault, and 3 related counts that his lawyer had bargained down from worse. The sentencing was 30 months with parole eligibility at 18. Ryan didn't go to the courthouse. He didn't have any particular feeling he needed to express about the outcome. The man had made choices, and the choices had consequences, and the system had done approximately what it was supposed to do, which was the most you could realistically ask of it. Marcus Webb was a longer and more complicated story. Detective Briggs, who called Ryan occasionally in the manner of a man who had decided they had a professional understanding and chose to maintain it, kept him loosely informed. Webb had indeed pulled back after the November operation, restructured, changed personnel, moved some of his business activity to adjacent cities. But the predatory loan structure was still running, quieter and more careful but intact. And Briggs was building a case from a different angle now, working with the State Financial Crimes Unit, whose interest had been activated by documentation that Vivian's legal team had quietly assembled over several months. It's slow, Briggs told Ryan one morning over the phone. It'll take time, but it's real. Real is better than fast, Ryan said. You sound like a cop. I was something similar once, Ryan said. Briggs was quiet for a moment. You ever think about doing something official? Consult basis, nothing formal. I've got a foundation to run, Ryan said. Right. A pause. You're going to be good at that. Ryan didn't know how to respond to that, so he said thanks and hung up, and went back to the Bridgeline program intake files he'd been reviewing, because January had started faster than he'd planned, and the first cohort of participants was already larger than the optimistic projection. 23 veterans in the first cohort, ranging from a 24-year-old Marine who had separated 8 months ago and was sleeping on his sister's couch in East Harlow, to a 51-year-old Army logistics officer who had been out for 6 years and had been steadily employed, but never in anything that used more than 30% of what she actually knew how to do. Each intake file was a specific person with a specific history, and Ryan read every one of them the way he read everything, thoroughly, looking for the thing that wasn't being said as much as the thing that was. Dr. Malone came to Harlow for the first cohort orientation. Ryan ran it with her, and afterwards she sat across from him in the Bridgeline conference room. They had a space now, a suite on the third floor of a building on Archer Street that was close enough to Sterling Consolidated to share some administrative infrastructure, but completely separate in its operation, which was important to Ryan in ways he'd been explicit about from the beginning. "You know what surprised me?" Malone said, gathering her materials. "What?" "The way they looked at you during the orientation." She zipped her bag. They weren't looking at a program director. They were looking at someone who knows what they're carrying. Ryan didn't say anything. "That's not a small thing," she said. "In this work. That's actually the whole thing." He thought about that for a long time after she left. The truth was that he did know what they were carrying. Not every version of it, every person's weight had its own particular shape, but the broad structure of it, the way service left you fluent in a language that the civilian world didn't speak and sometimes didn't know existed. The way you could be functional and present and good at your job and still feel, on certain days and in certain moments, like you were operating on the other side of a glass from the ordinary texture of life that other people moved through without thinking about it. He knew it because he'd lived it. He was still, on some days, living it. That was the thing he hadn't said clearly to anyone, not to Vivian, not to Briggs, not to Dr. Malone. He hadn't started Bridgeline from a position of having solved the crossing. He'd started it from a position of being somewhere in the middle of it himself, which maybe made him less qualified by some measures and more qualified by others. He'd decided it made him more. Not because his own unfinished business made him better. It didn't. But because a man who was still figuring it out could be honest with people who were still figuring it out. And honesty was the thing the check-ins required above everything else. He wrote that down. He didn't know yet what he'd do with it. Maybe a training document for the check-in staff. Maybe something he'd say to the second cohort. Maybe nothing. Maybe it was just a thing he needed to name for himself. In February, Lily's school had a parent presentation day, where parents came in and talked about their work. Lily informed Ryan of this obligation with 1 week's notice, which he suspected was deliberate, and told him she had already told Mrs. Garfield that he would attend. "What if I had a conflict?" he said. I didn't give you time to develop one," Lily said without apology. He went on a Wednesday morning, sitting in a small plastic chair in a fifth-grade classroom. Lily had moved up since the class placement shuffle in January, beside a pediatric nurse and a man who imported specialty foods, and a woman who was a structural engineer. Ryan was last. He told the class about the Bridgeline Foundation. He told them what veterans were and what the transition looked like, and why the crossing was hard. He did it in language an 11-year-old could track, which was honestly not that different from the language he used with program participants. And halfway through he noticed that the room was quieter than it had been for the other parents. The particular quiet of people who are actually listening rather than waiting for their turn to talk. A kid in the second row put her hand up. "Did you ever get scared?" she asked. "When you were in the military?" Ryan looked at her. He looked at Lily, who was in the third row, watching him with the particular attention she reserved for things she was going to think about for a while. "Yes," he said. "Quite a bit." "But you kept doing it anyway?" "For a while," he said. "And then I stopped, because stopping was the right call. Being scared is information. It tells you something's at stake." He paused. "The trick is learning to use the information without letting it make all your decisions." The kid in the second row nodded slowly, as if filing this. Lily, in the third row, had a look on her face that he couldn't fully interpret but would probably think about for a while himself. Afterward, Mrs. Garfield shook his hand in the hallway and said it was one of the most honest presentations she'd had in 6 years of parent days, which he received with a nod because he didn't have a better response to it. Lily walked out beside him toward the school entrance, her backpack on, her jacket half unzipped as always. "The scared thing," she said. "Yeah. I didn't know you got scared." "I told you I did once," he said, "before I left the service." "You said you were uncertain," she said. "That's different from scared." He looked at her sidelong. Uncertain is scared with better vocabulary, he said. She considered this. That's actually a useful distinction. Keep it. She zipped her jacket up halfway, a compromise with the weather he'd never seen her make before. And they walked to the truck in the thin February cold, and she climbed in and put her backpack in the footwell and said, "That girl in the second row is named Ades, and she wants to be an astronaut." "Good for her," Ryan said. "She asked me after if you were always that honest." "What did you say?" "I said mostly." Lily looked out the window. It seemed accurate. He started the truck. It was a Saturday in late March when Vivian suggested the café. She texted him on a Friday evening. "Tomorrow morning?" "I know it's the weekend." "Crestwood?" He looked at the text for a moment. Crestwood, 5th and Delancey. The corner table by the window and the worn chair in the back and the morning that had started every subsequent thing. "Sure," he sent back. 8 o'clock. He got there first. Old habit. He got the same corner table he'd had 4 months ago, ordered the same black coffee, and sat in the same chair that had still been occupied by a man with a toolbox and a dripping kitchen faucet and a field trip he couldn't quite afford. The cafe looked the same. The amber light through the window was the same early morning quality, the same smell of ground coffee and something baked, the same dark wood. Becca, the server who had brought him a fresh coffee without being asked on the morning everything changed, was behind the counter. She recognized him when he came in. He saw it in the brief expression, something between surprised and pleased, and brought his coffee over herself. "You're back," she said. "Apparently," he said. "It's been quiet since November," she said. "Good." She smiled and went back to the counter. He sat with his coffee and looked at the table by the window, which was empty. The light fell across it the same way it had the morning Vivian sat there with her laptop and her half-finished coffee and the focused look of someone managing important things. He thought about what had been true in him in that moment, the particular calculation he'd done when Dominic walked across the room. The weight of that decision, which hadn't felt like a decision at all in the moment, but which he understood now, with 4 months of distance, had been one of the most consequential he'd made in a long time. Not because of what followed. Those consequences had been their own kind of accident. The foundation, the cohort, the check-ins, the slow ongoing building of a thing that might actually work. But because of what it said about the kind of person he was trying to be, after everything, he had stood up because it was the right thing. Not because he'd calculated an outcome. Not because he'd weighed the personal cost and determined it was acceptable. He'd stood up because somewhere in him, under the careful life he'd assembled, and the quiet he'd fought to maintain, and the grief he'd learned to carry without putting down, there was still a man who believed that ordinary decency was worth acting on without asking for permission from the room first. Lily was right that he got scared. He had been scared that morning, not of Dominic, but of what stepping in would cost. The disruption to the careful equilibrium he and Lily had built, the attention it would draw. The scared was real. He'd stood up anyway. That, he thought, was the actual shape of every decent thing he'd ever done. Not the absence of fear, not the presence of confidence, not some quality of character that came naturally and required no effort. Just the ongoing decision, made in real time, with real stakes, to act on what you believed rather than what was convenient. He was still sitting with that when the door opened and Vivian came in. She was in a coat he hadn't seen, dark green, slightly too large in the shoulders, the kind of coat that looked like it had been bought for comfort rather than presentation. Her hair was down. She looked like a Saturday morning, which was to say she looked like a person rather than a professional, and he found he preferred it, though he noted the preference without doing anything with it. She saw him and came across the room and sat down in the chair across from the corner table. The empty chair. The one that had been across from him every time he'd sat in this particular corner of this particular cafe for the past year and a half. She wrapped both hands around the coffee that Becca brought without being asked. "How's the first cohort?" she asked. 7 of them started jobs in the last 3 weeks, he said. 2 more have offers pending. The remaining 14 are at different points in the process. 3 of them are hard cases. The check-in model is doing what it's supposed to do, but it's slow. "Slow is okay," she said. "That's what I keep telling Renata." "How's Dr. Malone?" "Back in Pittsburgh. We're on the phone twice a week." He drank his coffee. "She wants to formalize the partnership, make Bridgeline a training site for her model." Vivian raised an eyebrow. That's a significant expansion. Not yet. Eventually. He turned the cup in his hands. How's your week been? It was an ordinary question, the kind two people asked each other when they'd been talking regularly enough that the question didn't need a formal reason behind it. He'd noticed sometime in February that they'd started doing that, calling or texting about things that weren't directly related to the foundation, small observations, occasional things Lily had said that he found himself wanting to share, a restaurant on Vine Street she'd told him about that turned out to actually be good. The accumulation of ordinary exchanges that happened when two people were paying attention to each other's lives. Long, she said. There's a board meeting on Monday that I've been preparing for since Wednesday. A quarterly review that 3 different departments have 3 different feelings about. And my mother called twice on Thursday, which means she wants to have a conversation I haven't made time for yet. About what? Vivian looked at her coffee. She wants to know if I'm happy. He looked at her. What did you tell her? He said. I told her I was busy. She looked up. Which is true. It's just not the whole answer. He held that for a moment. Are you? He said. She met his eyes across the table. Outside, Harlow was going about its Saturday morning. Unhurried, slightly softer than the weekday version, the city in a minor key. Through the cafe window, the light was the specific gray gold of late March, the tail end of winter making its last unremarkable argument before spring arrived and made everything else possible. I think so, Vivian said. It's a work in progress. She paused. You? Ryan looked around the cafe, at Becca behind the counter moving efficiently between customers, at the couple near the window sharing a newspaper, the same retired couple he'd seen 4 months ago, comfortable in each other's silences. At the corner table where he was sitting, the same chair, the same worn jacket, the toolbox gone now, a different life in most of the ways that mattered, and the same in the ones that ran deepest. Yeah, he said. I think so. He meant it the same way she did, not as an arrival, not as a settled thing, but as the honest assessment of someone who had been doing the work and could see, if not the destination, at least the direction. The truth was that happiness, in Ryan's experience, wasn't a state you reached. It was a practice, the same way courage was a practice, and decency was a practice. Something you kept doing, imperfectly, on the good days and the grinding days alike, because the alternative was to stop doing it, and stopping was the one thing that guaranteed nothing got better. He'd learned that from a woman who was gone now, who had faced the end of her life without flinching, and had been more fully herself in the last months of it than most people managed in a lifetime. He'd tried to learn it from her while she was alive and had mostly failed, because you rarely understood what someone was teaching you until after they were finished teaching it. He was still learning it. He would probably always be learning it. That was the human condition, as far as he could tell. You didn't get a finished version of yourself. You got the version you were working on, right now, today, with the information and the limitations you actually had, and you made the decisions you could live with from that version, and you kept going. He thought about the 23 people in the Bridgeline cohort, each one in the middle of a crossing that nobody had built a bridge for. He thought about Lily drawing viperfish with oversized teeth at the kitchen table, submitting essays about gap-toothed smiles, asking questions that were more accurate than the answers adults usually had ready. He thought about Claire saying that the best sandwiches had exactly 4 components, and any more was hubris, and how much of his life that particular memory lived in. He thought about a morning in November when a man had walked across a cafe toward a woman sitting alone, and a man in a worn jacket had put down his coffee and stood up, not because he had a plan, not because he knew how it would end, but because the alternative was to look away. And he'd made a decision a long time ago about the kind of person he was going to be, and that person did not look away. None of what followed had been smooth. None of it had been the right amount of difficult. It had been more difficult than it needed to be, and also, in the ways that mattered, not difficult enough to break anything that was worth keeping. He had a sore shoulder that still ached occasionally in the cold. He had 8 new gray hairs that he'd counted in the mirror one morning and then decided not to think about. He had a daughter who was now firmly in the habit of informing him of school obligations with strategically insufficient notice, and a foundation that was 11 weeks old and already more complicated than the original design, and a woman across the table at a corner cafe whose coffee had gone warm while she was talking, the same way his always did. You should drink that, he said, nodding at her cup. She looked at it. It's probably cold. Becca will bring you another one. How do you know? She brought me one in November when I hadn't asked, he said. This place does that. Vivian looked at the cup, then at him, with the expression that wasn't quite a smile but lived in its neighborhood permanently. You remember a lot of detail about that morning, she said. I pay attention, he said. I know you do, she said. I noticed that about you before you stood up. He looked at her. From the window table, she said. Before all of it started, I noticed the man in the corner who was watching the room the way people usually only watch rooms when they have a reason to. She turned the cup in her hands. I thought you were a cop. What did you think when you found out I wasn't? I thought you were something more specific than a cop, she said. And I thought... She stopped, looked at the table, started again with the honesty he'd come to expect from her, the kind that didn't ask permission before it spoke. I thought, whoever that man is, I hope he stays in this city. He was quiet for a moment. I'm not going anywhere, he said. She looked up at him. Outside, the March morning was doing what late winter mornings in Harlow did, trying unevenly to become something warmer. Pale light on the wet street. A couple walking past with a dog. Somewhere down the block, a delivery truck going about its ordinary business. Becca appeared at the table with a fresh coffee for Vivian, unbidden, and set it down without comment and walked away. Vivian looked at it. Then she looked at Ryan. Okay, she said, and something in the word carried more than it usually carried. Not a concession and not an agreement, just a person opening a door they'd been standing near for a while and deciding to walk through it. He drank his coffee. She drank hers. The cafe went on around them, ordinary and warm and full of the small human business of a Saturday morning, people arriving and leaving, conversations starting and ending, the gentle ongoing noise of a room where nobody was afraid and nobody was looking away. And the chair across the corner table, for the first time in a long time, was not empty. It was a small thing, maybe. One table in one cafe in one city, two people drinking coffee on a Saturday morning after a hard November that had changed the shape of both their lives in ways neither of them had planned, and both of them, carefully and imperfectly, were still figuring out. But Ryan had learned, from the service, from Claire, from 3 years of raising a daughter who saw through things with her mother's eyes and said what she thought, with a precision that cost him something every time, that the small things were where most of the actual living happened. The big moments got the attention, but the small ones were where you found out who you were. The coffee you stopped for on a cold morning, the chair you pushed back from, the 2 words you said to a man twice before deciding that twice was enough. He had stood up in a cafe in November, and the world had not changed. Dominic Reeves would probably find his footing again eventually, in some diminished form. Marcus Webb was still out there, slower and more careful, waiting for an angle. The city was what it had always been, imperfect, grinding, full of people trying to make their particular lives work on the margins they had. But 23 veterans were crossing a bridge that hadn't existed before. And Lily had submitted an essay about her teeth to a teacher who wouldn't understand it for another decade. And Becca had brought a fresh coffee to a woman she'd never been introduced to, because that was what this cafe did. And some things about a place could become its character if you let them. And Ryan Mercer was sitting in the corner of Crestwood Café on a Saturday morning in late March, with his coffee and the woman across the table whose coat had shoulders that were slightly too large and whose mother wanted to know if she was happy. And he was thinking, not about the next threat, not about the next problem, not about any of the things that had occupied the careful, vigilant machinery of his mind for most of the past 3 years. He was thinking about nothing much at all, which was, for a man who had spent most of his adult life thinking about everything all the time, its own kind of arrival.